For my late wife's birthday, all I asked was that my son take her old compass to be repaired, a small brass keepsake I had carried in my jacket pocket for 30 years, without ever once opening it more carefully than a quick glance at the needle. 3 days later, my son called me, his voice tight and strange, and told me the antique dealer who'd examined it had gone completely pale, refused to say another word about it over the phone, and told him, in no uncertain terms, to bring me to the shop immediately and show absolutely no one else what was inside. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that phone, running through every possible explanation my engineer's mind could construct, none of which came anywhere close to what I would actually discover that afternoon. Before I tell you what that dealer found hidden inside a compass I'd carried for 3 decades without ever suspecting it held a secret at all, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe the truth has a way of waiting patiently, however long it takes to be found. My name is Arthur Reynolds. I am 69 years old, and for 38 years I worked as an aerospace engineer, spending most of my career at a mid-sized aviation firm here in the city, designing structural components for commercial aircraft, the kind of quiet, exacting work that rewards patience and precision, far more than ambition or flash. I retired 7 years ago with a comfortable pension, a modest but well-kept house that my late wife Eleanor and I bought together in 1987, and a reputation among former colleagues as a man who checked his calculations 3 times before ever signing off on a design, a habit that occasionally frustrated younger engineers eager to move faster, but that never once led me to sign my name to something I hadn't fully verified. I had started my career considerably more modestly than I ended it, working my way up from a junior drafting position after finishing my engineering degree on a partial scholarship, the son of a machinist father and a mother who cleaned offices at night to help make ends meet during the years I was in school. That upbringing instilled in me a particular kind of careful, methodical patience that served me well throughout my career. The understanding that good work, done thoroughly and honestly, eventually earns the recognition it deserves, even if that recognition arrives more slowly than a person might hope. Eleanor passed away 11 years ago from a sudden aneurysm that took her from me in a single terrible afternoon, no warning at all. One moment discussing what to plant in the garden that spring, and the next gone entirely. A loss so abrupt that I still, more than a decade later, find myself occasionally reaching for the phone to tell her something, before remembering all over again that she isn't there to answer. Eleanor was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the most interesting person in the room. A school teacher for nearly 30 years who still receives, even now, the occasional letter from former students, thanking her for believing in them when few other adults had bothered to. She had a particular gift for seeing potential in people long before they saw it in themselves. A gift that had, over the decades of our marriage, gently pushed me toward opportunities I might have otherwise talked myself out of, including, I would later remember with a particular ache, encouraging me to stay in touch with Victor even during the years our careers had pulled us in different directions. I still remember, vividly, the particular way Eleanor used to hum quietly while grading papers at our kitchen table in the evenings, an old habit from her own mother that she'd never fully explained, but that had become, over 35 years of marriage, one of the small, ordinary sounds I most associated with feeling at home. I remember her careful, deliberate way of choosing gifts, the wedding gift compass being only one example among decades of thoughtfully chosen presents that always seemed to carry some small, private meaning, specific to whoever was receiving them. Losing her had felt, in the years immediately following her death, like losing not just a partner but a particular kind of clarity about the world, the confident, warm certainty she always seemed to carry about which things in life actually mattered. Her birthday falls in early spring, and every year since she passed, I have marked the day quietly, privately, usually by driving out to the small cemetery where she's buried, and sitting with her for an hour, telling her, out loud, about whatever had happened in my life over the preceding year. It is, I recognize, a somewhat unusual habit for a man who spent decades grounded entirely in engineering logic and verifiable calculation. But grief, I have found, does not care much for logic, and I have never seen much point in denying myself whatever small comfort that ritual provides. This particular spring, approaching what would have been her 68th birthday, I found myself thinking about the compass, An old brass pocket compass that had belonged to my father before me, passed down when he died, and that Eleanor had given to me as a wedding gift decades earlier, having had it professionally cleaned and restored at the time, along with a small inscription added to the inside of the case. A private joke between us about never losing our way back to each other. I had carried that compass in my jacket pocket nearly every day for over 30 years, through decades of engineering work, through Eleanor's illness and death, through the slow, quiet accumulation of an old man's ordinary days, and in recent years, the hinge had grown stiff, and the glass face had developed a hairline crack I'd simply learned to work around. My son Kevin is 41 years old, a software engineer who lives about 40 minutes from me, with his wife and 2 young children. A good, steady man, who I have always been quietly proud of, even during the years when our relationship, like so many father-son relationships, cooled somewhat under the ordinary pressures of adulthood, career, and distance. Kevin had inherited, I've always thought, a fair amount of my own methodical temperament, though he'd channeled it toward computer systems rather than physical structures, and I remember the particular pride I felt watching him build his own career from the ground up, the same patient, incremental way I had built mine decades earlier. Kevin and Eleanor had been especially close when he was young, and I knew, asking him to handle the compass repair as a small birthday tribute to his mother, that he would understand the sentimental weight of the task without needing much explanation. "Of course, Dad," he told me over the phone. "I know a good antique restoration place downtown. I'll take care of it." I remember the particular warmth in his voice during that call, a warmth that had grown somewhat rarer between us in recent years as his own family and career demanded more of his attention. And I felt, hanging up the phone that day, a small, grateful reminder that whatever distance had grown between us, the fundamental closeness was still there beneath it, waiting for the right occasion to surface again. Kevin took the compass to Hargrove & Sons Antiques, one of the oldest and most respected antique dealerships in the city, run by a man named Elias Hargrove, whose family had operated the shop across 3 generations, specializing in the kind of careful, painstaking restoration work that requires both mechanical skill and genuine historical knowledge. The shop had been a fixture in that part of downtown for as long as I could remember, tucked between a used bookstore and a small tailor's shop, the kind of place that seemed almost deliberately resistant to the passage of time, its window display rotating slowly through decades of estate jewelry, pocket watches, and mechanical curiosities that most people walked past without a second glance. Elias himself had taken over the business from his father nearly 20 years earlier, having trained as a young man under both his father and grandfather, learning the particular, patient craft of restoration that required understanding not just how mechanical objects worked, but how they had been built, by whom, and often, why. He had a reputation throughout the city's small community of collectors and appraisers, as someone who treated every piece that came through his door with the same careful reverence, regardless of its market value, a philosophy he had apparently once explained to Kevin, during that first drop-off visit, as simply, "Every object carries a story, and my job is to make sure that story survives whatever repair it needs." I remember Kevin telling me, almost as an afterthought during a call, 2 days after dropping it off, that Mr. Hargrove had seemed unusually excited, examining the compass, turning it over carefully under his jeweler's loupe, commenting on the fine craftsmanship of the original casing, details neither Kevin nor I had ever thought much about, beyond its obvious sentimental value. He kept asking where it came from, who made it originally, Kevin told me. I told him I honestly had no idea, that it was just an old family piece. He seemed almost disappointed I couldn't tell him more. Neither of us thought much of that particular detail at the time, assuming it was simply the natural professional curiosity of a man who spent his career surrounded by objects with hidden histories. 3 days after dropping it off, Kevin called me again, and I knew immediately from the strain in his voice that something had happened. "Dad, I need you to come down to Hargrove's shop, today if you can." Mr. Hargrove said not to tell anyone, not even Mom's side of the family, and definitely nothing online or on the phone. He wants to show you something in person. I asked Kevin, naturally, what exactly the issue was, whether the compass had been damaged during the repair process, and Kevin, sounding genuinely rattled, told me he honestly didn't know, that Mr. Hargrove's face had gone completely pale the moment he'd opened the compass casing fully to assess the internal mechanism, and that he'd refused to say anything further beyond insisting I come down myself as soon as possible. I remember standing in my kitchen after that call, staring at my own reflection faintly visible in the darkened window above the sink, trying to imagine what could possibly warrant this level of caution over a simple family keepsake. My first instinct, absurd as it sounds now, was that perhaps the compass had turned out to be some kind of stolen or forged historical artifact, that Hargrove had somehow identified a legal complication that required careful, discreet handling. I never once considered, driving downtown that afternoon, that the secret might be something my own family had unknowingly carried for 3 decades, tucked inside an object I had handled almost daily, without ever suspecting its true weight. I drove downtown that same afternoon, a low, uneasy feeling settling in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. The same particular unease I used to feel occasionally reviewing a structural calculation that looked correct on paper but somehow didn't sit right in my gut. The kind of instinct 38 years of engineering had taught me never to fully ignore. The drive took nearly 30 minutes through afternoon traffic, and I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, running through every possible explanation, wondering whether the compass had been damaged beyond repair, whether Hargrove had discovered some structural flaw that made it dangerous or valuable in some way I couldn't anticipate. My engineer's mind cycling through possibilities, the way it always had when facing an unknown problem. Elias Hargrove met me at the door of his shop personally, a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s with the careful, deliberate movements of someone accustomed to handling delicate, valuable objects, and I noticed immediately that he locked the door behind me and turned the shop's sign to closed, before saying a single word. The shop itself smelled of old wood polish and aged paper, shelves lined with clocks, jewelry boxes, and mechanical curiosities collected over decades, the particular hushed, reverent atmosphere of a place where old things are treated with the seriousness they deserve. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, leading me to a small back workroom, lit by a single bright lamp positioned over a velvet-lined tray. "I want you to understand, I've been restoring antique compasses, watches, and mechanical instruments for over 40 years. I have opened hundreds of pieces exactly like this one. I have never, in all that time, found anything quite like what's inside yours." He gestured toward the tray, where the compass sat open, its casing separated cleanly into 2 halves, revealing, beneath the original mechanism, a shallow secondary compartment I would never have known existed, expertly concealed within the thickness of the brass casing itself, accessible only through a mechanism so subtle that Hargrove himself admitted he'd nearly missed it entirely, discovering it only because a slight, almost imperceptible weight discrepancy had prompted him to examine the casing more closely than a standard repair would normally require. "Whoever built this compartment," Hargrove continued, "was not an amateur. This required real skill, machining tolerances I rarely see even in high-end antique pieces. Someone wanted this hidden well enough that it would survive decades of ordinary handling without ever being discovered by accident." I remember staring at that small, precisely cut compartment, thinking immediately of Victor, of his own considerable mechanical skill, a thought that arrived fully formed before I even fully understood why. Some old, half-buried recognition, surfacing before my conscious mind had caught up to it. Inside that hidden compartment were 3 items, carefully folded and preserved, despite the decades that had clearly passed since they were placed there. A letter, several pages long, written in handwriting I recognized instantly, despite not having seen it in over 30 years. A small stack of documents that appeared, at a glance, to be old corporate share certificates, and a single sheet of paper covered in a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me at first glance, though something about their structured, deliberate formatting suggested they weren't random. I sat down slowly in the chair Hargrove offered, my hands unsteady as I unfolded the letter, and began reading words written, according to the date at the top of the first page, almost exactly 31 years earlier, by a man I had once considered my closest friend in the world, a man named Victor Hale. Victor and I had grown up together, 2 boys from the same working-class neighborhood who had both, against considerable odds, worked our way into engineering careers, and who had, in our early 30s, co-founded a small aerospace components company together, Reynolds Hale Dynamics. a modest but genuinely promising venture that manufactured precision parts for regional aviation contractors. I remembered, reading Victor's letter, exactly how the two of us used to sit up late in his cramped apartment kitchen, sketching designs on napkins, arguing good-naturedly about tolerances and material choices, the particular electric excitement of two young men convinced they were building something that mattered. We had started with almost nothing, a small loan, second-hand equipment, and the kind of stubborn optimism only two men in their early 30s, with everything to prove, could sustain through the brutal early years of running a startup. I had left the company after only 4 years, taking a more stable position at the larger firm where I would eventually spend the remainder of my career. A decision driven largely by Eleanor's pregnancy with Kevin, and my own growing discomfort with the financial risk of running a small startup while starting a family. I remember the conversation where I told Victor I was leaving, sitting across from him in that same cramped kitchen, watching something complicated cross his face. Disappointment mixed with genuine understanding, because Victor, unmarried and childless at the time, simply didn't carry the same weight of responsibility I felt pressing down on me with a child on the way. "I get it, Art," he'd told me. "Family comes first. Just don't disappear on me completely." I had promised him I wouldn't, a promise I had. In the slow, ordinary way, life sometimes erodes even our sincerest intentions, eventually failed to fully keep. Victor had stayed on, continuing to build the company, and our friendship, though it never formally ended, had slowly faded over subsequent years, the way friendships sometimes do when the daily proximity that sustained them disappears, replaced by the demands of my own growing family and career. Occasional holiday cards eventually thinning to nothing at all by the time a full decade had passed. I had heard secondhand sometime in my early 40s that Reynolds Hale Dynamics had filed for bankruptcy, the company's assets liquidated, Victor himself apparently having simply disappeared from the industry entirely, moving out of state according to the one mutual acquaintance who still occasionally passed along news. I had felt a distant, unresolved sadness about it at the time, the particular melancholy of watching something you once helped build collapse from a distance. But I had never pursued the details further, assuming, as most people would, that the company had simply failed the way so many small ventures do, one more casualty of a difficult industry, never once suspecting there might be a considerably darker explanation hiding beneath that assumption. The letter Victor had hidden inside that compass told an entirely different story. "Arthur," it began, "if you are reading this, then either I found a way to get this to you directly, which I doubt I will manage, or someone eventually discovered it, long after I'm gone, which seems more likely given everything that has happened. I need you to know the truth about what happened to our company, because I have carried the weight of this alone for years now, and I no longer trust that I will survive long enough to tell you myself." The letter went on to describe, in careful, methodical detail, exactly the kind of documentation style I remembered from Victor's engineering work decades earlier. A discovery he had made roughly 2 years before the company's supposed bankruptcy, uncovering evidence that our then financial director, a man named Gregory Voss, had been systematically embezzling funds from Reynolds Hale Dynamics for years, funneling company assets into a series of shell accounts before ultimately staging the company's collapse entirely, filing fraudulent bankruptcy documents that erased the legitimate ownership claims of Victor and several smaller shareholders, myself included, despite my having sold my own shares back to the company years earlier, under terms I now suspected, reading Victor's account, had themselves been manipulated. Victor wrote that once he'd confronted Voss privately with what he'd discovered, he had been threatened, explicitly and unambiguously, that pursuing the matter further would result in consequences to his safety and his family's safety that he was not willing to risk. He described feeling trapped, unable to go to authorities without evidence. Voss had already begun systematically destroying, unable to warn me or the other affected shareholders, without potentially endangering all of us, and ultimately choosing to hide the evidence he had managed to preserve, the original share certificates and financial documentation proving the fraud, inside the one object he trusted would eventually find its way back to me. "You gave me this idea without knowing it," Victor's letter continued. "I remembered you telling me once that a good hiding place isn't one nobody would think to look, it's one nobody would think exists at all. I hope, whenever you find this, that enough time has passed that whatever danger I felt is no longer a concern for you. I am sorry, old friend, for the silence. I hope you understand, it was never really a choice. I remember reading Victor's letter for the first time in Hargrove's back workroom, being struck immediately by how completely his handwriting had remained unchanged across 3 decades. The same distinctive slant, the same particular way he crossed his sevens that I remembered from countless engineering sketches and napkin calculations from our earliest years together. Victor had grown up 2 streets over from my own childhood home. Both of us, the sons of factory workers who had scraped together enough for us to attend the same underfunded public high school, where an unusually dedicated physics teacher had first recognized something promising in both of us and pushed us, separately and together, toward engineering scholarships neither of our families could have otherwise afforded. We had been inseparable through college, sharing a cramped apartment for 2 years, working part-time jobs together to cover rent, staying up late arguing about everything from thermodynamics to baseball, the particular intense, formative friendship that sometimes only happens once in a person's life, during those specific years when everything still feels wide open and possible. I remember Victor standing beside me at my wedding to Eleanor, serving as my best man, delivering a toast that had the entire reception laughing, and, by the end, more than a few people quietly wiping away tears. A toast I could still recite portions of decades later. That particular gift Victor had for finding exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. Reading his letter that afternoon in Hargrove's shop, I felt the full weight of everything I had lost when our friendship faded. Not just the specific truth about Reynolds-Hale dynamics, but the ordinary, everyday companionship of a friend who had known me before I became anyone, before the career, before Eleanor, before Kevin, a friend who had believed in my potential before I had much evidence to believe in it myself. I understood, sitting in that back room, that I had spent 31 years assuming Victor had simply drifted away, when in reality, he had spent those same 31 years protecting me from a danger I never knew existed, carrying that burden entirely alone, isolated from the very friendship that might have made it bearable. The share certificates, once I examined them carefully alongside the coordinates on that final sheet, appeared to reference a secondary set of financial records, a location, Hargrove speculated after examining the coordinate format more closely, that likely corresponded to a safety deposit box or storage facility somewhere. Details Victor had apparently encoded deliberately, rather than risk writing plainly. I called an old professional acquaintance the following morning, a retired financial crimes investigator named Rosalind Chu, who I had met years earlier through a mutual friend at the aviation firm, and who had built a respected post-retirement consulting practice specifically helping victims of complex corporate fraud untangle decades-old financial schemes. Rosalind had spent nearly 25 years with the state's securities division before retiring, and I remembered her, from the handful of times our paths had crossed socially over the years, as a sharp, unflappable woman who rarely seemed surprised by anything, a quality that would prove invaluable in the weeks ahead. Rosalind agreed to meet with me the same week, and I also reached out to a retired detective named Harold Bishop, a careful, methodical man I had known socially for years through a local chess club, who agreed to help with the investigative legwork Rosalind's forensic accounting work would require. I met with both of them together for the first time at Rosalind's small home office, spreading Victor's letter, the share certificates, and the coded coordinates across her dining room table, while she and Harold examined each piece with the same careful, deliberate attention I remembered Hargrove giving the compass itself. Harold, a barrel-chested man in his 70s, with a decades-honed instinct for spotting inconsistencies, picked up the coded sheet almost immediately, turning it over in his hands. "This isn't random," he said, echoing what Hargrove had already suspected. "Look at the grouping pattern. This is coordinates, encoded simply enough that someone in a hurry, or someone frightened, could still remember the key even under stress." He was right, as it turned out, though it would take him and Rosalind nearly 2 weeks of careful cross-referencing against old banking directories and safety deposit box registries to fully decode it. Rosalind and Harold spent the following 6 weeks working through the documentation Victor had preserved, cross-referencing the old share certificates against surviving corporate records from Reynolds-Hale Dynamics, most of which, remarkably, remained accessible through state business archives, despite the company's decades-old dissolution. Rosalind explained to me, during one of our early meetings, exactly why she believed a case this old remained pursuable at all. Fraud cases like this don't have the same statute of limitations complications people assume, she told me. When evidence of the fraud was deliberately concealed, and can be shown to have been deliberately concealed through continued, ongoing action, like Preston's involvement appears to demonstrate, the clock essentially resets. This isn't a cold case, Arthur. This is an active, ongoing crime that simply hasn't been discovered yet. What they uncovered confirmed everything Victor's letter had described. Gregory Voss had indeed orchestrated a sophisticated fraud, systematically diverting company assets over approximately 18 months before staging the bankruptcy, using a series of shell entities to obscure the money trail before it eventually resurfaced, reinvested, over subsequent decades, into an entirely different, considerably more successful holding company that Voss himself continued to quietly control, operating now under a different name entirely. Harold, working through old corporate filing records with the patient thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years building cases from paper trails, traced the shell company structure Voss had originally used back through 5 separate intermediary entities before finally connecting it definitively to his current business, a process that took nearly 3 weeks of careful, unglamorous document review. This is honestly some of the most sophisticated concealment work I've seen from this era, Rosalind told me, reviewing the completed timeline with obvious professional respect mixed with disgust. Voss was clearly intelligent, methodical. If your friend Victor hadn't managed to preserve those original documents, this fraud would have simply disappeared into history, the way most fraud from this period unfortunately does. Rosalind explained the mechanics of the original fraud to me in careful detail during one of our early sessions, walking me through exactly how Voss had structured the scheme decades earlier, using the kind of patient, methodical explanation I imagined she'd given countless fraud victims over her long career. The basic structure is actually elegant, in a horrible way, she told me, sketching a simple diagram on a legal pad. Voss, as financial director, had legitimate signing authority over company accounts. Over about 18 months, he gradually redirected incoming client payments through a series of intermediary accounts before they ever reached the company's actual books, meaning the company's recorded revenue looked like it was declining even though real money was still coming in, just not to where it should have been going. She tapped the diagram with her pen. Then, once the company's official books showed enough of a decline to make bankruptcy plausible, he staged the collapse, using falsified creditor claims to justify liquidating remaining assets at deeply discounted prices, assets that were then purchased, through more shell entities, by companies Voss himself secretly controlled. The shareholders, including you and Victor, lost your equity entirely in the bankruptcy proceeding, while Voss walked away owning, indirectly, everything the company had actually been worth. I remember sitting with that explanation for a long moment, understanding, with the particular clarity my engineering training had always given me for systems and structures, exactly how deliberately and patiently the entire scheme had been constructed, decades before advanced forensic accounting tools existed to easily detect this kind of layered concealment. What makes this case unusual, Rosalind continued, is that Voss didn't stop there. Most fraud like this, the perpetrator cashes out and moves on. Voss kept reinvesting the stolen assets over decades, growing them substantially, which actually works in our favor now. The larger the current value of what he built on top of the original theft, the larger the restitution obligation once we can prove the chain of ownership back to the original fraud. That explanation, more than almost anything else, helped me understand why Rosalind and Harold had approached the investigation with such careful, unhurried thoroughness. Understanding that the eventual recovery depended entirely on building an unimpeachable chain of evidence connecting 3 decades of continuous, deliberate concealment. The coordinates decoded, with Harold's help and the assistance of a locksmith familiar with older commercial storage systems, to a long-forgotten safety deposit box at a regional bank branch that had, remarkably, remained active and paid for continuously for over 3 decades through an automatic account Victor had apparently established before his death, which Rosalind's research indicated had occurred nearly 22 years earlier, considerably sooner than I had ever known. A car accident in another state that I had never even heard about at the time, having lost touch with him so completely by then. I remember the particular grief of learning that detail, sitting in Rosalind's office as she read the details from an old obituary she'd located. A brief, sparse notice that mentioned no surviving family, no memorial service, simply a name and a date and a location that meant nothing to me at the time. Victor had died alone, it seemed, in a state I'd never known him to have any connection to, and I found myself wondering, in the days that followed, whether he had been running from something even then, whether the fear he'd described in his letter had followed him for the remainder of his life, forcing him into a kind of quiet, isolated exile I could barely imagine for a man who had once been the most gregarious, confident person I knew. Accessing the safety deposit box itself required considerably more legal maneuvering than any of us initially expected, given that Victor had, understandably, been careful never to list any accessible beneficiary, apparently trusting the coordinates hidden in the compass to eventually lead the right person there through legitimate legal channels, rather than risk drawing attention through a more direct designation. Eugene Whitfield, a retired estate attorney Rosalind recommended, who had handled several complex historical property cases over his career, worked for nearly 3 weeks navigating the bank's compliance requirements, eventually securing a court order that allowed access based on the compelling documentary evidence Victor's letter and the coded coordinates together provided. I remember the day we finally opened that box, standing in a small private viewing room at the bank, alongside Rosalind, Harold, and Eugene, the bank's compliance officer watching with visible curiosity as we worked through the formal verification process. Inside, Rosalind and Harold, working with the proper legal authorization Eugene arranged, found the complete original financial records Victor had managed to copy before Voss could destroy them, comprehensive enough, once fully reviewed by forensic accountants, to demonstrate conclusively that the legitimate shareholders of Reynolds Hale Dynamics, myself included, retained legal claim to assets that had grown, over the following 3 decades of reinvestment under Voss's continued management, to a value Rosalind's preliminary estimate placed at somewhere between $18 and $24 million. There was also, tucked among the financial records, a single photograph I hadn't expected to find. Victor and me, considerably younger, standing in front of the original Reynolds Hale Dynamics workshop on what must have been our very first day of operation, both of us grinning with the particular unguarded pride of young men who believed, without any real evidence yet, that they were about to build something meaningful together. I held that photograph for a long time, sitting in that small viewing room, and I understood, more clearly than anything Rosalind's financial documentation could have shown me, exactly why Victor had chosen to hide the truth inside a gift Eleanor had given me, rather than simply attempt to reach me directly, all those years ago. He had trusted that whatever happened to him, that photograph, that friendship, would eventually find its way back to the surface, patiently waiting inside an object neither of us could have imagined would carry it safely across 3 decades. But the discovery that struck me hardest during that 6-week investigation had nothing to do with the money itself. Rosalind, tracing the more recent financial threads connected to Voss's current holding company, discovered that my own longtime financial advisor, a man named Preston Callahan who had managed my personal investments and retirement planning for nearly 20 years, someone I had trusted implicitly, recommended to me originally, ironically, by a mutual acquaintance from my aerospace career, had a documented professional history connecting him directly to Voss's current company, having worked there as a junior associate decades earlier, before eventually establishing his own independent advisory practice. I remember the particular disbelief of hearing that connection laid out for the first time, sitting in Rosalind's office reviewing a printed employment history she'd pulled through public records, Preston's name listed clearly among Voss's early staff decades earlier, a detail he had never once mentioned in 20 years of quarterly meetings, birthday cards, and the easy, familiar rapport I had genuinely believed reflected real friendship rather than careful, sustained professional management. I thought back over years of conversations, small comments Preston had made about his early career, that I now understood had been carefully vague, deliberately steering around any specific mention of his time working under Voss. Rosalind's deeper investigation revealed something considerably more troubling than simple professional overlap. Preston, it turned out, had been aware for years, likely from very early in our professional relationship, of the unresolved Reynolds Hale Dynamics fraud and my own dormant, unrealized claim to it. Financial records Rosalind obtained through subpoena showed Preston had received, over the preceding 15 years, a series of consulting payments from Voss's holding company, specifically tied to what internal correspondence, eventually recovered, described only as asset containment services, a vague euphemism that, once cross-referenced against the timeline, appeared to describe exactly one thing: ensuring that I, and the other surviving Reynolds Hale shareholders, never discovered the truth about what had happened to our company decades earlier. Harold, reviewing the payment structure with me during one of our sessions, pointed out something that made the full scope of the betrayal even clearer. "Look at the timing here, Arthur," he said, tapping a printed spreadsheet. "These payments increased noticeably every time you made a major financial decision, every time you restructured your retirement accounts, every time there was any activity that might have prompted a deeper audit of your assets or their history. This wasn't a one-time arrangement. Preston was actively monitoring you, on Voss's behalf, for over a decade." I sat with that particular discovery for several difficult days, the particular grief of understanding that a man I had trusted with my entire financial future for 2 decades had been quietly, deliberately working against my own interests the entire time, likely including. Rosalind and Harold eventually confirmed through careful tracing of estate paperwork records from years earlier, some role in ensuring that when Eleanor's family, during the initial restoration and appraisal of the compass shortly after our wedding, had it examined by an appraiser Preston himself had recommended, no further investigation into its hidden compartment had ever been suggested. The appraiser's notes from that examination, recovered from old business records, suspiciously vague about the compass's internal mechanism despite otherwise thorough documentation of its exterior craftsmanship. That particular detail, more than almost anything else in the entire investigation, unsettled me the most. It meant Preston, or someone connected to him, had known about the compass's significance since nearly the beginning of my marriage to Eleanor, decades before I had ever hired him as my financial advisor, which raised troubling questions about whether our entire professional relationship had been engineered from the start, specifically to maintain that careful, decades-long surveillance, rather than developing organically the way I had always assumed it had. I chose to say nothing to Preston during the weeks Rosalind and Harold continued building the case, continuing our regular quarterly portfolio review meetings exactly as I always had, discussing retirement account performance and modest investment adjustments with the same calm, unremarkable civility that had characterized our relationship for 2 decades, giving him no indication whatsoever that I now understood the full scope of what he had been quietly protecting all this time. Those meetings, I will admit, tested the same discipline I had spent 38 years developing as an engineer, the ability to remain calm and analytical, even when every instinct urges a more immediate, emotional reaction. I remember sitting across from Preston in his tastefully appointed office, watching him walk me through quarterly performance charts with his usual polished confidence, making small jokes about market volatility, asking after Kevin and his family, with what had always seemed like genuine warmth, and that I now understood, watching more carefully, carried the particular practiced quality of someone who had spent years perfecting exactly the right amount of personal interest to maintain trust without ever risking real vulnerability. I remember one meeting in particular, roughly a month into the investigation, when Preston mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard through industry channels that some old aerospace companies from decades earlier were occasionally coming up in unusual legal contexts lately, old fraud cases being reopened due to advances in forensic accounting. "Funny how these things resurface sometimes," he said, watching me with an expression I now recognized as careful, probing curiosity rather than idle conversation. I told him I hadn't heard anything about that, keeping my own expression carefully neutral, understanding that he was testing the waters, trying to determine whether any of the quiet inquiries Rosalind and Harold had been making around Voss's business dealings had somehow reached back to me. I found, during those weeks, a strange, unexpected clarity in maintaining that performance. A clarity that reminded me, in some ways, of the careful, methodical discipline required in engineering work. The ability to hold multiple complex truths simultaneously, without letting emotion compromise the precision of the analysis. Rosalind commented on it once, during one of our own meetings, telling me she rarely saw clients handle this particular kind of prolonged, quiet confrontation as steadily as I seemed to be managing it. I told her, honestly, that 38 years of double-checking calculations before signing off on anything had taught me more about patience than perhaps any other single lesson in my professional life, and that this situation, as painful as it was, simply required applying that same discipline to a considerably more personal problem. It was Preston himself, eventually, who inadvertently accelerated everything. Word had apparently reached him, through channels Rosalind and Harold were never fully able to trace, that questions were being asked, somewhere in the periphery of Voss's current business dealings, and Preston arrived at my house unannounced one evening, considerably more anxious than his usual polished professional demeanor, asking, with careful, deliberate casualness, whether I still had that old family compass Eleanor had given me, mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that a collector client of his had expressed interest in antique aviation-era compasses and would be willing to pay a genuinely substantial sum for mine specifically. I invited him in, offered him coffee with the same easy hospitality I always had, and listened to him describe this supposed collector in vague, unconvincing detail, noting the particular tension in his posture, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the small side table in my living room, where I sometimes left the compass sitting in plain view. "It's just a nice piece of family history to me, Preston," I told him, watching him carefully. "I'm not sure I'd want to part with it." He pressed gently, mentioning the figure again, emphasizing how silly it would be to turn down that kind of money for just an old compass, and I told him I would think about it, watching him carefully, understanding immediately that he had no idea I had already discovered exactly what that compass actually contained, and that his sudden, urgent interest in purchasing it confirmed everything Rosalind and Harold's investigation had already established. 2 weeks later, Preston returned with a formal written offer, nearly $40,000 for what he described as simply a well-crafted antique piece, with modest historical value, an offer so disproportionate to any legitimate antique valuation that it served, in its own way, as the clearest confirmation yet of exactly how much he understood was actually hidden inside it. I remember sitting across from him at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had eaten thousands of ordinary meals together, watching this man I had trusted for 2 decades try to talk me into selling away the truth of what had happened to my closest friend, and feeling something harden inside me that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a quiet, resolute clarity about exactly what needed to happen next. I told Preston I would accept the offer, watching a flicker of genuine relief cross his face. Relief I understood now was the particular relief of a man who believed he was finally, after years of careful management, closing the door permanently on a secret that had never stopped threatening to unravel his entire arrangement with Voss. I told him I would need a week to finalize a few personal matters before completing the sale, and I asked whether he would be willing to attend a small gathering I was planning to host. A reunion, I told him, of former colleagues from my aerospace career, old friends I hadn't seen in years, a gathering I framed as entirely unrelated to our business arrangement, but that I hoped he would still attend as my longtime advisor and friend. Preston agreed readily, clearly pleased at how smoothly everything appeared to be resolving itself, and I remember shaking his hand at my front door that evening, maintaining the same warm, unremarkable civility I had shown him for 2 decades, feeling the particular strange discipline of extending genuine courtesy to a man I now understood had spent years quietly working against me. A discipline I recognized, even in the moment, as something I owed as much to my own sense of self-respect as to any strategic advantage it provided. I spent that week working with Rosalind, Harold, and Eugene, the same careful, methodical planning I imagine my own father, a Navy veteran, would have recognized as something close to military precision, reaching out to former Reynolds-Hale Dynamics shareholders and employees Rosalind's research had identified, several of whom, remarkably, still lived in the area and remembered the company's collapse with the same lingering, unresolved confusion I had carried myself for decades without ever fully understanding why. I also arranged, through Rosalind's contacts, for representatives from the state's financial crimes unit to be present, positioned discreetly, ready to move the moment the evidence had been fully presented. Reaching out to those former colleagues proved to be one of the more emotionally difficult aspects of the entire preparation process. I remember calling a woman named Dolores Fitch, who had worked as our office manager during the company's early years. A warm, no-nonsense woman I remembered fondly from decades earlier, now in her 80s and living alone in a small retirement community across town. When I explained, carefully, that I had discovered evidence suggesting the company's collapse had been a deliberate fraud rather than an ordinary business failure, she was quiet for a long moment before telling me, her voice thick with old grief, that she had lost nearly her entire modest retirement savings when the company folded, savings she had never fully recovered from, forcing her to work well into her 70s simply to remain financially stable. I always wondered, she told me. Something never sat right about how sudden it all was. Thank you for calling me, Arthur. Whatever happens, thank you for not letting this just disappear. I heard variations of that same sentiment from nearly a dozen other former colleagues and investors over that week. People who had spent decades quietly carrying an unresolved, unexplained loss, some of whom had built entire, more cautious financial philosophies around that early betrayal, without ever understanding its true cause. Compiling their contact information, listening to their stories, understanding the full human scope of what Voss's fraud had actually cost, beyond the abstract dollar figures Rosalind's spreadsheets described, gave the entire investigation a weight and purpose that extended far beyond my own personal grievance with Preston. Eugene, working alongside this outreach effort, prepared the formal legal documentation that would need to be presented at the gathering itself, careful to ensure that everything shown to the assembled guests would hold up not just emotionally, but legally, anticipating that Preston, or Voss's own attorneys, would likely attempt to challenge the evidence's admissibility once formal proceedings began. We only get one chance to do this cleanly, Eugene told me during our final planning session. I want every document authenticated, every chain of custody documented, before you say a single word in that room. On the evening of the gathering, nearly 30 former colleagues, employees, and investors filled the private event room I had reserved at a hotel downtown, along with Elias Hargrove, who I had asked to attend specifically to authenticate, publicly, exactly how the hidden compartment had been discovered. I remember standing near the entrance beforehand, watching familiar faces arrive, men and women I hadn't seen in over 30 years. Some visibly older and grayer than I remembered, others instantly recognizable despite the decades. All of them arriving with the same faint, uncertain curiosity about why exactly they'd been invited to what I'd vaguely described only as an important update regarding Reynolds Hale dynamics. Rosalind had arrived early with me, along with 2 members of the state's financial crimes unit, dressed in plain business attire, positioned unobtrusively near the back of the room, coordinating quietly with hotel security to ensure the room's single exit remained unobstructed and clearly visible throughout the evening. Harold had taken up a position near the audiovisual equipment, having personally verified, that afternoon, that the presentation materials Rosalind and Eugene had prepared were properly loaded and ready. Unwilling, he told me, to leave anything about this particular evening to chance, after everything we'd worked through together. I remember Rosalind pulling me aside briefly before the guests began arriving, checking, one final time, that I felt genuinely prepared for what was about to happen. You don't have to do this the way we planned it, Arthur, she told me. If it feels like too much once you're standing up there, we can adjust. I told her honestly that I had never felt more certain of anything in my professional or personal life, that 38 years of engineering had taught me that the best time to present a conclusion is only once every supporting calculation has been verified beyond doubt, and that we had, over the preceding weeks, verified everything beyond any reasonable doubt. Preston arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably as always, greeting old acquaintances with his usual polished charm, entirely unaware of exactly what the evening actually held. I watched him move through the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, offering the kind of warm, professional small talk that had always made him so effective in his advisory role. And I felt, watching him, a complicated mixture of anger and something almost like pity, understanding that whatever else Preston had done, he had also spent 2 decades building a professional relationship with me, built entirely on a foundation he knew, every single day, was rotten underneath. I stood before the assembled guests and explained, briefly, that we had gathered to finally resolve a decades-old mystery surrounding the collapse of Reynolds Hale dynamics, watching Preston's expression shift, subtly but unmistakably, from polite interest to something considerably more guarded, his eyes flicking toward the exits, in a way I recognized immediately, from decades of watching how people behave when they sense a situation shifting beneath them. I felt, standing there, a strange calm settle over me, the same particular steadiness I remembered from decades of presenting technical findings to review boards, the understanding that thorough preparation, more than any natural confidence, is what actually carries a person through a moment like that one. Many of you remember Victor Hale, I began, watching several faces in the room shift immediately at the mention of his name. Old affection and old grief-crossing features that had, until that moment, simply looked politely curious about why they'd been invited. Victor was my closest friend, and my business partner, decades ago. Most of you were told, as I was, that our company failed because of poor management, bad market timing, simple bad luck. Tonight, I want to show you what actually happened. I invited Elias Hargrove forward, and he opened the compass once more, exactly as he had in his workshop weeks earlier, revealing the hidden compartment to the room, reading aloud, in full, Victor's letter, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, every word landing with the particular weight of a truth finally, after 31 years, finding its way to the people who deserved to hear it. I watched recognition and horror spread across several faces as Hargrove read Victor's account of Voss's fraud, former shareholders and employees exchanging stunned glances, finally understanding, after 3 decades, exactly what had actually happened to the company and the livelihoods they had lost alongside it. One woman near the back of the room, a former administrative assistant I vaguely remembered from the company's early years, began quietly crying, and I learned later that her own father had been one of the smaller shareholders who lost his modest retirement savings when the company's fraudulent collapse was finalized, dying years later still believing the failure had simply been bad luck rather than deliberate theft. A man I recognized as one of our original suppliers, an elderly gentleman named Sam Whitfield who had provided precision machining services to the company during its early years, stood up partway through Hargrove's reading, his voice shaking with old, unresolved anger. "I lost my own business 2 years after yours collapsed," he said to the room, not waiting to be acknowledged. "I always wondered if there was something more to it. I just never had any way to prove it." Several other guests murmured agreement. Old grievances and half-formed suspicions from 3 decades earlier, suddenly, finally, finding confirmation in the room around them. And I watched Preston's face, in particular, drain of all color as Rosalind stepped forward next, presenting the financial documentation tracing his consulting payments from Voss's holding company, the internal correspondence describing asset containment services, the suspiciously vague appraisal notes from decades earlier. Rosalind walked the room through each piece of evidence with the same careful, methodical precision I imagined she'd once used testifying in her own professional career, building an undeniable, comprehensive picture that left no room for interpretation or doubt. Preston attempted, briefly, to protest, insisting there had been some misunderstanding, that his relationship with Voss's company had been entirely unrelated to my own affairs, his voice carrying a thin, unconvincing edge of the same polished confidence he'd used for 2 decades to reassure me about our quarterly portfolio reviews. But the documentation Rosalind laid out, methodically, piece by piece, left no room for any interpretation beyond exactly what it was, and I watched the room's collective attention turn fully against him. Old colleagues who had known him only peripherally through my own recommendations, now looking at him with open, undisguised contempt. And precisely as the full scope of the evidence had been presented, representatives from the state's Financial Crimes Unit entered the room, moving directly toward Preston, informing him, and, separately, agents dispatched to Voss's current business address, that both men were being formally investigated in connection with a decades-old securities fraud scheme, now considerably better documented than it had ever been at the time it occurred. Preston did not resist, though I noticed his hands were shaking as officers guided him toward the door, the same polished composure that had defined every interaction I'd ever had with him, finally, completely collapsed. In the months that followed, the state's Financial Crimes Unit built a comprehensive case against both Gregory Voss and Preston Callahan. The original fraud from Reynolds-Hale Dynamics, thoroughly documented through Victor's preserved records, corroborated by Rosalind's forensic accounting work tracing the decades of continued financial benefit both men had drawn from the original theft. Voss, facing considerably more serious exposure given his role orchestrating the original fraud, ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included substantial prison time and a comprehensive restitution order, while Preston, whose role, though significant, had been more that of a facilitator protecting an existing scheme rather than its original architect, faced somewhat lesser, but still serious charges related to fraud and obstruction. I attended a portion of Voss's sentencing hearing, curious, in some strange way I still don't fully understand, to finally see in person the man whose decades-old decision had shaped so much of my own family's history without my ever knowing it. He was an unremarkable-looking man, considerably older and grayer than the confident, ambitious figure Victor's letter had described, and I felt, watching him stand before the judge, not the satisfaction I might have expected, but something closer to a strange, hollow sadness, the recognition that an entire company, an entire group of people's livelihoods, had been sacrificed decades earlier for a fortune this same man now stood to lose entirely anyway. Legal proceedings to formally re-establish the ownership claims of the original Reynolds-Hale Dynamics shareholders took the better part of a year, working through Eugene's legal guidance alongside a broader team of attorneys representing the various affected shareholders, ultimately resulting in a settlement that returned a substantial portion of the grown assets to their rightful owners, myself and the handful of surviving original investors, along with the estates of shareholders who had passed away in the intervening decades, without ever knowing what had actually happened to their investment. I attended several of those settlement meetings personally, watching elderly former colleagues and, in some cases, the grown children of shareholders who hadn't lived to see this resolution finally receive some measure of justice for a theft that had shaped their families' financial trajectories for 3 decades, without their ever understanding why. Dolores Fitch, the former office manager I had called during that first week of planning, received a settlement that, she told me afterward with tears in her eyes, finally allowed her to fully retire for the first time in over a decade. I visited her at her retirement community shortly after the settlement cleared, bringing a small bouquet of flowers, and she held my hands for a long moment, telling me that whatever else had happened, my refusal to simply let the truth stay buried had given her, in her 80s, a measure of peace she had genuinely never expected to receive. That conversation, more than almost anything else in the entire ordeal, confirmed for me that pursuing this had been the right decision, regardless of whatever personal cost or discomfort it had required along the way. My own share of the recovered assets came to just over $4 million, a figure so far beyond anything I had ever expected from a simple compass repair that I spent several weeks afterward, in a strange, disorienting daze, uncertain what to actually do with a fortune I had never sought, and had certainly never needed to feel that my life had been complete. I thought during those weeks, often about Eleanor, about the particular joke behind that inscription she'd had added inside the compass case all those years ago, never losing our way back to each other, and about the strange, almost impossible way that private joke had ended up leading me back to a truth neither of us could have ever imagined it contained. I announced at a small gathering of family and close friends several months later that I intended to donate the majority of the recovered fortune to establish the Eleanor Reynolds Education Foundation, a scholarship fund specifically supporting first-generation college students pursuing careers in engineering and education, the 2 fields Eleanor and I had each devoted our lives to. Kevin, who had been present for nearly every stage of the investigation since that first strange phone call from Hargrove's shop, told me it was exactly what his mother would have wanted, and I believe, with the particular certainty that comes from 35 years of marriage, that he was right. The foundation awarded its first 3 scholarships this past fall, and I attended the small ceremony personally, watching 3 young people, none of whom had ever met Eleanor, receive support that will shape the trajectory of their lives, the way her own quiet encouragement once shaped mine. I remember, in particular, one of those first scholarship recipients, a young woman named Adaeze Okonkwo, the first in her family to attend college, studying mechanical engineering, with the same careful, methodical seriousness I recognized immediately from my own early career. She approached me after the small ceremony, thanking me personally, and told me she hoped to someday build something that mattered, the way Eleanor apparently had, teaching generations of students who might not have otherwise believed in their own potential. I told her honestly that Eleanor would have been considerably prouder of that ambition, than of any dollar figure attached to the scholarship itself, and I meant every word of it. I have set aside a portion of the remaining recovered assets as well for Dolores Fitch and several of the other elderly former shareholders and employees whose settlements, while meaningful, still left considerable gaps given the decades of compounded loss they had each experienced. It felt to me like the only appropriate use of a fortune I had never sought and had certainly never needed for my own comfort. A fortune that had, after all, only come to light because Victor had trusted, decades earlier, that it would eventually find its way back to the people who deserved it. I still carry that compass in my jacket pocket most days, the hinge finally repaired properly by Hargrove himself, the hidden compartment now empty, its contents preserved instead in a small fireproof box alongside Eleanor's other keepsakes. I think, often, about Victor, about the particular loneliness of the choice he made decades ago, hiding evidence of a truth he couldn't safely reveal, trusting that somehow, someday, it would find its way back to the people it was meant to protect. I visited his grave for the first time this past year, once Rosalind and Harold's research had located it, a modest plot in a small town 2 states away, where he had apparently spent his final years living quietly, under circumstances I still don't fully understand. And I sat there for a long while, telling him, the way I still tell Eleanor, everything that had finally come to light because of what he'd protected. I brought Kevin with me on that trip, wanting him to understand, in some tangible way, the full scope of the man whose careful, patient hiding place had eventually reshaped both our lives. We stood together at that quiet, modest grave, in a small cemetery considerably plainer than Eleanor's, and I told Kevin stories about Victor he had never heard, about our college years, about the wedding toast, about the particular kind of friendship that shapes a person permanently, even after decades of separation. Kevin was quiet for a long time afterward, and on the drive back, he told me that he understood now, more clearly than he ever had, why I had approached the entire investigation with such careful, methodical patience, rather than simply pursuing the money as quickly as possible. "This was never really about the money for you, was it, Dad?" he asked. I told him he was right. It had never been about the money at all. I never got the chance to thank Victor properly, or to tell him that his careful, patient faith in that hiding place was eventually rewarded, 3 decades later, by a son who simply wanted to fix his mother's compass for her birthday. But I like to believe, in whatever way makes sense to believe such things, that he knows now, that the promise I made him all those years ago in his cramped apartment kitchen, not to disappear on him completely, was ultimately kept, however long it took, however strange and roundabout the path turned out to be. I have also, in the time since, made a quiet, deliberate effort to stay more genuinely connected with Kevin and his own young family, understanding, in a way this entire ordeal made painfully clear, exactly how much distance can accumulate between people who love each other simply through the ordinary neglect of not making enough effort. I have dinner with Kevin's family every other Sunday now, a small, consistent ritual that reminds me, every time, of the Sunday dinners Eleanor once insisted on, and I find myself, watching my 2 young grandchildren at that table, thinking often about how quickly an ordinary, unremarkable life can accumulate the kind of quiet richness that no fortune, however large, could ever fully replace. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance a person can leave behind isn't gold, or jewelry, or even money, but a truth carefully preserved, patiently waiting for the right moment to finally come home. That, I have come to believe, is the real lesson this entire journey taught me, more valuable, in its own quiet way, than the fortune itself. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe some truths are worth the wait, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.